silence of Roswell. Welcome to Midnight Tales. Tonight, as the world outside fades into the soft embrace of the night, we turn our gaze toward a horizon that once shimmered with an impossible light. We are traveling back to the high desert of New Mexico, to the summer of 1947, a time when the wind carried more than just dust, and the stars seemed to reach down and touch the earth. Close your eyes. Breathe in the scent of dry sage and cooling sand. Let the rhythm of the desert settle your heart as we begin the story of a mystery that still echoes through the canyons of history. This is the story of Roswell. Long before Roswell became a name etched into the collective wonder of humanity, it was a place defined by its vast, echoing solitude. In the midsummer of 1947, the land was a monochromatic expanse of amber plains, jagged ridges, and dirt roads that stretched into the infinite. Time here was measured not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow rotation of the sun and the shifting shadows of the scrub brush. At the heart of this stillness was the Foster Ranch, a sprawling, lonely stretch of earth northwest of town. This was the domain of Elias Thorne. Elias was a man of the soil, a weathered soul with skin like aged parchment and hands that understood the secret language of the wind and the wire. To him, the desert was not a void, it was a companion. He lived in harmony with the heat and the hush, finding a peculiar peace in the isolation that would drive most men to madness. On the night of July 2nd, the atmosphere over Roswell was heavy, charged with a strange, electrical tension that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. The crickets had fallen into an uneasy silence, and the sky was a deep, velvety indigo, flickering with dry lightning that offered no promise of rain. Elias lay awake on his cot, listening to the desert breathe. Suddenly, sometime past the midnight hour, the stillness was shattered. It wasn't the low, rolling rumble of a summer storm. It was a sound that defied every terrestrial law Elias knew, a sharp, metallic shriek, followed by a violent tearing sensation, as if the very fabric of the sky was being unzipped by a colossal, invisible blade. A singular thundering impact echoed through the draws, a heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards of his cabin. Then, as quickly as the chaos had arrived, the world plunged back into a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. Elias waited, his heart thumping like a trapped bird, but there were no sirens, no voices, only the cold, indifferent stars overhead. The following morning, the sun rose with a predatory brilliance, bleaching the hills and casting long, sharp shadows across the parched earth. Elias mounted his mare, Willow, and rode out toward the northern pastures, a cold knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. The wind was hot and dry, carrying a faint, acrid scent, a burnt metallic trace that caught in the back of his throat, a smell that had no place among the sagebrush and cattle. It wasn't long before he crested a ridge and saw the scar. Stretching across a patch of field, nearly a quarter-mile wide, was a swath of wreckage that defied imagination. It looked as if a celestial jeweler had spilled a bag of silver confetti across the dirt. Thousands of fragments glinted with a fierce, unnatural light under the desert sun. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching against grass that had been scorched a sickly, translucent gray. He crouched down and picked up a length of material that looked like ordinary foil. But when he squeezed it into a tight ball, it didn't crinkle or tear. The moment he released his grip, the metal flowed back into its original mirror-smooth shape, as if it possessed a memory of its own form. Nearby, he found structural beams that were feather-light yet stronger than any steel he had ever struck. Along their edges were delicate, violet-tinged markings, symbols that resembled a frantic, beautiful shorthand, an alien script that spoke of a logic far beyond the reach of human understanding. He stood there, a solitary figure in a sea of impossible debris, and for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne felt the desert, the collector of shroud. The morning air at the Roswell Army Airfield was crisp, carrying the sharp, clinical scent of aviation fuel and sun-baked asphalt. For Silas Vance, a man of meticulous observation and quiet intelligence, the day had begun like any other, under the pale, stretching light of a New Mexico dawn. But as he stood outside the barracks, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a vibration beneath the surface of military routine that whispered of something anomalous. Silas was not a man given to superstition. He was an intelligence officer trained to see the world in facts and figures. Yet, when the report arrived from the sheriff's office regarding a remote ranch and a field of impossible debris, his instincts flared with a sudden, cold clarity. He drove toward the Thorn Creek homestead in a dust-covered Jeep, the engine's rhythmic hum the only sound in the vast, golden silence of the desert. The landscape rolled past him like a faded tapestry of mesquite and dry riverbeds. When he finally reached the gate, he found Elias Thorne waiting, a man whose silence was as deep as the canyons around them. They spoke little. The desert had a way of stripping away unnecessary words. Together they rode toward the northern pasture, the horses' hooves rhythmic against the brittle earth. As they crested the final ridge, the sight of the impact unfolded before Silas's eyes. It was a scar upon the world. The debris didn't just lie on the ground, it seemed to occupy it, glinting with a luster that felt predatory under the harsh sun. Silas dismounted and walked into the center of the wreckage, his boots crunching on grass that felt strangely hollow. He reached down and picked up a shard of the silver-violet material Elias had described. It was feather-light, almost weightless, yet when he tried to bend it, the resistance was absolute, unlike any alloy known to the Air Force. He found a section of the material etched with those same haunting symbols, intricate, flowing characters that seemed to shimmer with a faint, internal violet light. They weren't painted or engraved. They were part of the metal itself, a language of light and geometry. "What do you make of it, Major?" Elias asked, his voice a dry rasp in the heat. Silas turned the fragment over in his gloved hand. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it were still radiating the absolute zero of the void between the stars. "It's not from any plane I've ever seen, Elias," he replied softly, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not from any world I know." They spent hours under the blazing sun, carefully gathering the fragments, wrapping them in heavy canvas as if they were holy relics. Each piece Silas touched sent a faint, harmonic vibration through his fingers, a hum that felt more like a memory than a sound. By the time the Jeep was loaded, the sun was dipping low, painting the Roswell horizon in bruised purples and deep, rust-colored oranges. On the drive back to the base, Silas made a detour to his own home, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name. His young son was playing in the yard, a small figure against the backdrop of the darkening desert. Silas called him over and, with a sense of quiet awe, showed him a sliver of the impossible metal. "Look at this, son," he whispered. The boy touched the surface, his eyes widening as the metal flowed back into shape after his small fingers pressed into it. "It's like magic, Dad," the boy breathed. Silas looked up at the first stars appearing in the sky, cold and distant. "Yeah," he murmured, the weight of the boxes in the Jeep feeling heavier than they had an hour before. "I think it is." He arrived back at the airfield as the desert air turned chilly. The guards at the gate saluted, unaware that the crates in the back of the Major's Jeep held the weight of official silence. "Welcome back to Midnight Tales. As the desert moon climbs higher, we find ourselves within the cold, corrugated walls of the Roswell Army Airfield. The discovery at Thorn Creek is no longer a solitary secret held by a rancher and a soldier. It is becoming a weight, a truth so heavy it threatens to bend the very foundation of the world we thought we knew. Settle deeper into your pillows. Let the hum of the night wind be your anchor as we step into the shadows where history was rewritten in a single afternoon." The sky had surrendered to a deep, bruised indigo by the time Silas Vance pulled his Jeep to a stop near the intelligence office. The base was transitioning into its nighttime rhythm, the distant, rhythmic clank of a supply truck, the low buzz of a flickering overhead lamp, and the soft, dry whistle of sand dancing across the concrete. Silas moved with a quiet, deliberate urgency. He carried the boxes inside as if they contained the brittle remains of a dream that might shatter if exposed to the light of day. Inside the small, windowless office, Captain Julian Reed sat under the warm glow of a single desk lamp, the scent of stale coffee hanging in the air. Silas set the first crate down on the worn wooden floor with a hollow thud. Together, in a silence that felt thick enough to touch, they peeled back the canvas. As the lamp light hit the fragments, the air in the room seemed to thin. Reed reached down and lifted a thin, metallic strip. He watched, mesmerized, as it bent easily between his fingers and then flowed back into its original, flawless shape the moment he let go. Silas picked up a curved section, its surface a dull silver that shimmered with faint, violet tones when tilted. On the inner curve, they saw them again, those delicate, intricate symbols etched with a precision that defied any human tool. "There are no wires, Silas," Reed whispered, his voice trembling. "No bolts, no engines. It looks as if it wasn't built, but grown." They spent hours passing the shards between them like holy relics, the weight of their confusion growing heavier with every piece that defied the laws of engineering. Neither man spoke the thought aloud, but it lingered in the room like the smell of ozone after a storm. This was not a secret weapon, and it wasn't from any country on the map. By morning, the atmosphere at Roswell had shifted from quiet wonder to a clinical, cold efficiency. In the public information office, the rhythmic clack of a typewriter began to echo. A brief, measured statement was drafted, words that would soon ignite the world. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday. By mid-afternoon, the headline was screaming from newspapers across the country. In the diners and barber shops of Roswell, voices buzzed with a mixture of awe and terror. "AF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region," the papers read. For a few fleeting hours, the veil had been lifted. But the celebration of truth was short-lived. By early evening, the orders from high command arrived, quiet, firm, and absolute. The narrative was to be reclaimed. A second statement was drafted, a clinical retraction that stripped the mystery of its wonder. It declared that the object was not a disk at all, but merely a weather balloon, a standard meteorological device misidentified by an overzealous officer. To seal the lie, a photograph was arranged. Silas Vance stood dutifully, his face a mask of exhausted obedience, beside a pile of tattered rubber and foil, material that bore no resemblance to the cold, humming metal he had touched in the desert. The flash of the camera popped, capturing a manufactured reality that would be printed in papers, the vanishing trace and the nameless farm. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. The desert has a way of swallowing things, tracks in the sand, whispers in the wind, and sometimes the very truth itself. As the official story of the weather balloon began to circulate like a cooling mist, a different kind of shadow started to stretch across Roswell. It was a silence that felt active, a deliberate erasure of the impossible. Settle deeper into the stillness. Let your mind drift as we follow the vanishing trail of the stars. The morning after the military's retraction broke quietly over the Thorn Creek homestead, but the air felt different, heavy and charged. Elias Thorne stood on his porch, eyes narrowed at the horizon. The desert hadn't changed, yet Elias noticed the subtle shifts. There were tracks at the edge of his property that didn't belong to his boots or his horses. He found cigarette butts near the fence line that still carried the faint, acrid scent of smoke. He was being watched, and the desert no longer felt like his sanctuary. Driven by a mounting unease, Elias rode into Roswell. The town was swarming with strangers, men in suits who didn't fit the dust-covered landscape. He tied his horse outside the office of Sheriff Miller and stepped into the cool, dim interior. Miller looked up, his face etched with a caution Elias hadn't seen before. "I've been seeing things, Sheriff," Elias whispered, his voice dry. "Tracks, shadows near the well. My dog won't even go near the barn." Miller leaned forward, his eyes searching Elias' face. "You don't have to tell the story anymore, Elias," the sheriff said softly. As Elias left the office, a reporter cornered him, notepad ready. Elias looked at the man, his voice hollow as he delivered the lie he'd been coached to say. "I made a mistake, just a weather balloon, that's all." Meanwhile, back at the airfield, Silas Vance watched the world he knew begin to dissolve. The detailed reports he had written, accounts of the violet symbols and the metal with a memory, had simply vanished from his desk. Men he had worked with for years now avoided his gaze. The crates of debris were gone, leaving behind only an empty, echoing space behind locked doors. Even the photographs had been confiscated, their negatives shredded into oblivion. It was as if the event was being erased by a quiet, deliberate patience. But the desert remembers what the papers forget, and if you are still awake, you know that Roswell was only the beginning. There are other stories, quiet sightings from ordinary people that never made the headlines. Story 1, The Nameless Farm. It was a cold November evening in 1974, in the wooded hills of rural Pennsylvania. Arthur had just finished locking the barn for the night while his family sat inside by the crackling fire. The air was unnaturally still, no wind, no crickets, just a weight to the silence. Then he heard it. A low, resonant hum that vibrated in his chest. He looked up, expecting a plane, but the sky was clear. Suddenly, a ring of soft, bluish-white lights appeared, hovering just 30 feet above his barn. A pale beam of light stretched downward like a slow-moving searchlight. Arthur couldn't move, his limbs felt pinned to the earth. Inside the house, his wife saw the glow, but when she opened the door, the power died instantly. The air smelled of ozone and scorched metal. By the time the lights vanished and the power returned, the barn was untouched, but the cattle pens were empty. No blood, no struggle. The red-eyed watcher of the North. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. As the desert heat of New Mexico fades from our minds, we travel across the ocean to a land of ice, ancient pines, and a silence that bites like the frost. We are going to the deep forests of northern Finland, where the sun barely touches the horizon and the night lasts for an eternity. In these woods, the snow hides more than just the earth. It hides eyes that do not belong to the living. Let the cold outside your window remind you of your warmth. Sink deeper into your blankets as we enter the winter of 1974. It was early March, and the forests near Ravinkille were still gripped by the iron hand of winter. A thick, suffocating layer of snow blanketed the world, turning the dark, twisted limbs of the pines into ghostly sculptures. The air was so cold it stung the lungs with every breath, yet for Lucas, a 38-year-old postal worker, the solitude was a sanctuary. He walked the familiar forest paths every evening, finding peace in the rhythmic crunch of his boots and the soft fog of his own breath. That night there was no wind. The forest felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for a sound that never came. Lucas walked with his hands deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the path ahead, until he saw a shape that shouldn't have been there. At first he thought it was a fallen tree trunk or a trick of the moonlight, but as he drew closer, the silhouette sharpened into something impossible. Standing in the center of the path was a figure nearly 7 feet tall. It was unnaturally slender, its limbs long and spindly, and its skin was a pale, translucent gray that almost glowed against the dark backdrop of the trees. The head was elongated, smooth, and featureless except for the eyes. They were large, abyssal pools of black, and deep within them, a faint, rhythmic red light pulsed like a dying coal. Lucas froze. His body refused to obey his mind, rooted to the spot by a dreamlike paralysis that wasn't born of fear, but of a strange, heavy vibration in the air. The figure did not move. It did not breathe. It simply watched him with those burning, crimson depths. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, the creature raised its left arm and pointed a long, thin finger into the dense woods beside the path. Lucas turned his head, expecting to see a craft or a light, but there was only the suffocating darkness of the pines. When he looked back, the path was empty. The figure had vanished without a sound, leaving only a lingering warmth in the air, as if a furnace had been burning in the snow. The encounter lasted only minutes, but the ripples lasted a lifetime. In the weeks that followed, Lucas was haunted by feverish, vivid dreams of metallic hallways and lights that hummed in a frequency he could feel in his teeth. He developed sudden, unexplained nosebleeds and headaches that felt like needles of ice. Most strangely, his body began to carry a static charge so intense that every surface he touched, doorknobs, faucets, even the paper at the post office, erupted with blue sparks. He eventually moved to the city, fleeing the lake visitor of Quebec. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, the air grows heavy with the scent of pine and the damp, cool breath of deep water. We are traveling north, beyond the flickering lights of civilization, to the mirrored surface of lac scent. Jean in Quebec, in the summer of 2003, four friends sought the silence of the wilderness, but they found a silence that wasn't of this earth. As you lie there, feel the stillness of the lake in your own room. Let the world outside vanish and listen to what the water witnessed. The northern stretches of Quebec are a mosaic of dense forests and ancient, deep lakes that hold their secrets well. In July of 2003, a group of four university students, looking for a reprieve from the heat of the city, pitched their tents along the southern edge of the lake. Among them was Alara, a woman who loved the rhythm of the wild. The first few days were a blur of clear water and laughter. On their third night, the group sat huddled around a campfire, the orange flames dancing against the encroaching dark. They were cooking sausages, the air filled with the comforting, smoky aroma of wood and fat. But just after midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The wind, which had been whispering through the pines all evening, vanished completely. The lake became unnaturally still, a sheet of black glass that didn't even ripple against the shore. The fire hissed as if the oxygen itself was being drawn away. Then a light appeared. Hovering barely 100 feet above the center of the lake was a massive, oval-shaped object. It was silent, a silence so heavy it felt like a pressure against their ears. Its surface was metallic, matte, and seamless, like a stone worn smooth by eons of cosmic travel. A ring of light circled its midsection, pulsing in gradients of violet and green, colors that seemed to vibrate between the visible and invisible spectrum. None of them reached for their cameras, none of them spoke. They stood frozen, bound by an awe that bordered on dread. That was when Alara pointed toward the water. There, directly beneath the hovering craft, a figure stood. It wasn't in the water, nor was it swimming. It was standing on the surface, as if the liquid had turned to stone beneath its feet. The figure was impossibly tall and slender, its limbs elongated and graceful. Its skin appeared pale, with a faint bluish tint that caught the shifting light of the craft. It had no visible face, just a smooth, reflective surface where features should have been. The figure didn't look at them. It seemed to be observing the depths of the lake itself. Suddenly, a log in their campfire popped loudly, a sharp crack that broke the spell. When they blinked, the craft was gone. There was no flash, no rush of wind, just empty sky where the impossible had been a second before. The stillness lingered for hours. The water remained frozen, and Alara realized her chest ached, as if she had forgotten to breathe for the duration of the sighting. In the morning, they didn't wait for breakfast. They packed their gear with trembling hands and left the lake behind. Back in the safety of the city, they searched for answers. There were no news reports, no official statements. But deep in the obscure corners of the internet, they found echoes of the shepherd's mirror. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, we leave the mirrored lakes and frozen forests behind to walk the windswept ridges of the Scottish Highlands. This is a land of ancient stone, rolling moors, and a silence so deep it feels like the breath of the earth itself. In the spring of 1958, a lonely valley known as Glen Lyon witnessed a convergence of the earthly and the celestial, a moment where time slowed to a heartbeat and the reflection of the stars took form. Settle into the warmth of your room. Imagine the smell of damp heather and the distant bleat of sheep as we walk into the mist. Glen Lyon is a place of solitude, a long, narrow valley where the hills fall steep into the shadows. In 1958, it was the home of Callum MacLeod, a shepherd who had spent more years in the company of the wind than with other men. Callum was a man of routine and quiet observation, a soul grounded in the shifting moods of the mountains. His only true companion was Skye, a border collie whose instincts were as sharp as the highland air. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, Callum noticed a change in the heavens. A section of the sky above the far ridge began to glow with a deep, unnatural amber hue. It wasn't the soft fade of a sunset. It was a vibrant, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from within the atmosphere itself. As the light drifted closer, it resolved into a vertical structure, a towering pillar of radiance that floated silently just above the heather. It cast no shadows on the rocks, and it gave off no heat, yet it commanded the space around it with a heavy, electric presence. Beside him, Sky let out a low, mournful growl, her fur bristling as she fixed her gaze on the descending column. Then the sheep began to move. They did not scatter in fear as they would from a wolf or a storm. Instead, they began to walk in a tight, rhythmic circle, their woolly backs turning in a perfect, slow-motion vortex. It was as if an invisible current was pulling them, a silent music they were compelled to follow. Callum tried to call out to Sky to move his flock, but his voice felt flat and hollow, as if the air around him had been drained of its ability to carry sound. From within the amber glow of the pillar, 3 figures emerged. They were tall, slender, and unmoving, their bodies lacking any human proportion. They wore no garments, the signal over sign. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, we leave the misty highlands for the ancient, sun-scorched silence of the Sinai Peninsula. This is a landscape where time feels etched into the very grain of the sand, a place of jagged mountains, deep starlit skies, and a stillness that has lasted for millennia. In the winter of 1982, amidst the quietude of a remote desert outpost, a group of specialists heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the radio waves of man. Settle deep into your pillows. Imagine the cool desert breeze brushing against the dunes as we listen for a signal from the stars. The Sinai is a land of profound isolation. In 1982, far from the flickering lights of any city, an Egyptian communications team was stationed near the Jebel Musa range. Their mission was to monitor the invisible threads of radio transmissions that crisscrossed the region, coded chatter, and the steady hum of long-distance frequencies. For Omar, a man who found comfort in the predictable math of wave patterns, most nights were a routine of static and silence. But at precisely 2:13 a.m. on a night when the moon was hidden, the routine was shattered. Every active channel on their monitors went dead, not with the hiss of interference, but with a sudden, heavy silence that felt physical. Then Omar noticed a single frequency pulsing on an unmarked band. It was a clean, narrow signal, a rhythmic beat like a heartbeat made of cold metal. As he adjusted the dials, a voice began to bleed through the speakers. It wasn't Arabic, it wasn't English or any human tongue. It was tonal, layered with a melodic hum that seemed to vibrate in the very structure of the building. At that moment, the temperature inside the monitoring hut plummeted, and the lights began to flicker with a rhythmic, dying pulse. Omar stepped outside into the biting night air. High above the desert floor, suspended between 2 mountain peaks, was an object that defied every law of aeronautics. It was a long, dark spindle, matte and seamless, rotating slowly in the starlight. It had no windows, no visible engines, just a dark, imposing geometry that seemed to absorb the light around it. Beside him, one of his colleagues began to walk toward the craft, his eyes unfocused, muttering in a language that sounded like the rhythmic tones coming from the radio. When they finally pulled him back inside, he collapsed into a sleep so deep it would last for 12 hours. The signal continued for exactly 33 minutes before vanishing instantly. In the aftermath, the team realized that the world had changed. The stars above the outpost seemed to have shifted, as if space itself had been stretched and then released. Every watch at the station was now off by exactly 7 seconds. The following morning, Colonel Malik ordered all recordings of the night to be destroyed, but Omar, driven by a quiet defiance, kept a single copy. Years later, he played that tape for Dr. Beaumont, a specialist in rare linguistics. The doctor went pale as the melodic hum filled the room, claiming the tones carried the mathematical. The fog station. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, we leave the dry sands of the desert and the windswept highlands for a place where the air is thick, cold, and heavy with the scent of salt. We are traveling to the jagged coast of Maine in the autumn of 1969. Here, where the Atlantic crashes against black, unforgiving rocks, a lonely weather station once stood, a sentinel against the gray abyss of the sea. But one night the fog brought something back from the deep that no instrument could measure. Settle into the safety of your room. Listen to the phantom rhythm of the waves as we enter the mist. The coast of Maine is a land of shadows and secrets, where the boundary between the water and the sky often dissolves into a pale, translucent gray. In 1969, just outside the quiet town of Machiasport, a small weather station perched on the edge of a crumbling cliff. It was a place of glass and steel, manned by two technicians who rotated shifts in total isolation. That autumn, the station was operated by Arthur Penhaligon, a former Navy man who preferred the company of barometric charts to the noise of the world. Arthur's job was simple: monitor the shifting pressures of the North Atlantic and transmit his findings twice daily. But on a Tuesday in late October, a strange fog arrived, not the slow, creeping mist of the coast, but a wall of white that moved with an unnatural, predatory speed. One moment the moon was casting a silver path across the ocean, the next the world had vanished. The visibility dropped to zero. Inside the station, the radios began to crackle with a rhythmic, pulsing static that hummed through the very walls. Suddenly the lights failed. Arthur fumbled for the backup generator, but the station's sensors refused to boot. Every needle on every dial spun in frantic, meaningless circles. Arthur walked to the thick observation window and pressed his face against the glass. There, hovering just above the churning surface of the sea, was a sphere. It was smooth, metallic, and perfectly motionless against the gale. It glowed with a faint, crystalline blue light, a light that didn't reflect off the white caps but seemed to sink into the water, illuminating the dark depths below. He reached for his logbook, his hands trembling as he recorded the time. But when he tried to use the radio to call for help, all he heard was a low, modulated tone, a pulse that felt like a heartbeat vibrating in his teeth. He stood at the window, transfixed by the glowing orb, until a shape emerged from the fog. It was a human silhouette, but it was far too tall, its limbs elongated and shimmering like heat rising off a summer road. It moved toward the station with a slow, mechanical, steady gait, gliding through the fog that never parted. The passenger in seat 33A. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. Tonight, we leave the solid ground behind and ascend into the thin, cold air of the upper atmosphere. We are traveling back to December of 1997, aboard a commercial red-eye flight crossing the vast, dark mirror of the Pacific Ocean. Imagine the low, steady hum of jet engines, a sound that becomes a lullaby for the hundreds of souls dreaming in the cabin below. But for one passenger, the night was about to reveal a layer of reality that no flight plan could ever account for. Settle into your seat, feel the slight vibration of the floor beneath your feet, and let the story carry you through the clouds. In late 1997, Flight 815 was traveling from Tokyo to Los Angeles, a long-haul journey through the silent corridors of the night sky. The cabin lights had been dimmed to a soft, ethereal blue, and most passengers were wrapped in blankets, drifting through the shallow stages of sleep. Outside, there was only the infinite black of the ocean and the occasional silver edge of a cloud. Adrian Sterling, a man who spent more of his life in hotel rooms and airport lounges than in his own home, sat near the rear of the aircraft. He was tired, his mind heavy with the details of a business trip that had lasted too long, but sleep remained out of reach. He sat by the window, a dog-eared paperback in his hands, watching the moonlight play against the wing. That was when he noticed the light. At first, he assumed it was a star, but it was far too bright, and it was moving with a fluid, intelligent grace that matched the plane's speed perfectly. It was a glowing sphere, a dull, breathing orange like the color of heated iron. As Adrian watched, 3 more spheres emerged from the darkness, forming a perfect triangular formation just below the level of the wing. There was no turbulence, no alarm from the cockpit, only a heavy, rhythmic pressure that began to build in his ears. Inside the cabin, the silence became oppressive. Adrian looked around, hoping to catch the eye of a flight attendant, but no one stirred. It was as if time itself had slowed into a thick, syrupy crawl. The engine's hum changed frequency, becoming a deep, vibrating tone that resonated within his own chest. Then he felt a presence beside him. Adrian turned his head slowly. Seated in the chair next to him was a figure that hadn't been there moments before. It was tall, unmoving, and dressed in a garment that seemed to absorb the dim cabin light. Its skin was as smooth and pale as polished bone, and its eyes, large, dark, and depthless, reflected nothing. The figure did not speak, and it did not turn to look at him, yet Adrian felt a single word enter his mind, clear and cold as an ice crystal. Observe, he blinked, and in that split second the world snapped back into focus. The cabin lights flickered, a baby cried 3 rows ahead, and the flight attendants continued their quiet walk down the aisle with their carts. Adrian looked out the window, but the orange spheres were gone. The stars were once again distant and indifferent. When the plane landed in Los Angeles, Adrian hurried through the terminal, his heart still racing. It wasn't until he was safe in a taxi that he looked down at his boarding stub. His seat was listed as 33A. He frowned, remembering the layout of the plane. He checked the airline's seat map on a nearby terminal screen. Flight 815, a Boeing 747, ended its rows at 32. Seat 33A did not exist. There was no record of his row ever being on that aircraft. Adrian never. The moonlit house of Cordoba. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. As the high-altitude chill of the Pacific flight fades, we descend toward the rolling hills of Cordoba, Argentina. Imagine a landscape of endless tall grass, where the dirt roads wind like ancient rivers and the power lines disappear into the violet haze of the horizon. Here, in 1989, a modest farmhouse with a red tin roof stood as a silent witness to a visitation that didn't just touch the earth, it made it bloom. Settle into your blankets, feel the warmth of a summer night in the southern hemisphere, and let the story unfold. In the spring of 1989, only Isadora Solis remained on the ancestral lands of her family. She was a retired teacher, a woman of 70 who found her rhythm in the garden, the company of her chickens, and her loyal black dog, Nico. She felt safe in her solitude, protected by the creaking rhythm of the old windmill that stood like a rusty sentinel near her porch. The night of the encounter began with a sound, not a roar, but a sharp, high-pitched static, like a radio caught between stations. Isadora sat up in bed, her heart a steady drum. Beside her, Nico didn't bark. He let out a low, vibrating whimper that she had never heard before. When she pulled back the heavy curtains, she saw them. Orbs of light, flickering with an intelligent, fluid precision, were gliding just above the empty field. They moved as if they were searching for something buried deep within the soil. Isadora opened the back door, and a heavy, electric tension greeted her. The air smelled of ozone and damp earth, but it was her garden that stole her breath. A soft, bluish light was rising from the very soil, casting long, distorted shadows across the fence. And standing amidst her vegetables were 2 figures. They were tall, slender, with skin that looked like polished gray-blue stone under the moonlight. They stood perfectly still, looking at nothing and everything at once. Isadora didn't feel fear. She felt a memory that wasn't hers. Images of streets she had never walked and voices speaking in tones she couldn't identify flooded her mind. Then, as if a switch had been thrown, the windmill stopped its creak. The orbs blinked out, and the tall figures turned in perfect unison, walking into the tall grass until they simply vanished into the shadows. The next morning, the air had returned to normal, but one of her vines had grown nearly a meter overnight. The lost time of Dr. Varma. We move now from the warm fields of Argentina to the frozen, crystalline silence of Lapland, Finland. It is the winter of 1974. Imagine a cabin made of dark logs, isolated on the edge of Lake Inari, where the snow is so deep it swallows the sound of the world. Here, a man of science, a physicist who believed everything had an equation, was about to face a variable that shattered his understanding of time. Close your eyes, feel the dry, biting cold outside your door, and listen to the hum of the north. Dr. Elias Varma had traveled to the cabin for a solo retreat. He brought no television, no telephone, only his notebooks, a kerosene lamp, and a mechanical watch he wound every night with religious precision. He was searching for a breakthrough in theoretical physics, but on the 6th evening the breakthrough found him. Just after dusk, a low vibration began to seep through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of a snowmobile. It was a musical, resonant hum that Elias could feel in his bones. He stepped outside, and there, hovering high above the frozen lake, was a pale disk of light. It didn't spin or blink. It simply existed, casting a shimmer on the snow that looked like moonlight trapped beneath ice. Elias looked at his watch. The second hand had frozen. The disk tilted slightly, pulsed with a single blinding flash of white light, and in the next heartbeat, Elias saw the sun rising over the pines. The fire in his hearth had gone out. His kettle was cold. He checked his calendar and realized that 2 full days had passed in what felt like a single second. His boots were wet, as if he had been walking through the deep snow of the lake, yet he had no memory of leaving his porch. Most hauntingly, his journal was open to a new page. In his own handwriting, curved symbols stretched in neat, rhythmic rows across the paper, a language he did not know, yet had clearly written. At the bottom was a single circle divided by a wave. Dr. Varma abandoned his research in physics after that winter. He spent the rest of his life studying resonance and sound, whispering to colleagues about a theory he called harmonic displacement. He died in 1993, leaving the journal behind on the cabin shelf. The lights beneath Loch Morar. The night carries us now to the jagged, mist-covered western highlands of Scotland. We stand on the banks of Loch Morar, one of the deepest and darkest bodies of freshwater in Europe. It is a place of fog and ancient stone, where legends of monsters have lived for centuries. But in the summer of 2001, something was discovered in the depths that was far more mechanical and far more silent than any beast of legend. Settle into the cool dampness of the highlands. Let the sound of the water lapping against the shore calm your spirit. Lachlan Murray, a forestry worker who knew every trail and hidden cove of the loch, was repairing fences on the remote eastern bank. He was a man of the earth, content with his tent, his gas stove, and his camera. On his second night, as a crescent moon rose over the peaks, Lachlan noticed a pale glow beneath the surface of the water. At first, he thought it was a reflection, but the glow moved against the current. It split into two distinct lights, rotating around each other like twin stars caught in a private orbit. They rose and fell within the dark water, silent and rhythmic. Then a third light appeared, a concentrated beam that pointed directly upward from the depths, as if searching the sky from below the earth. Lachlan felt a heavy pressure in the air, a thickness in the atmosphere that made it hard to move. He watched as the lights ascended faster and faster beneath the surface, only to blink out all at once, leaving the loch in total, crushing darkness. In the morning, Lachlan checked his camera. Every photo he had taken of the lights was a pure white frame, as if the film had been exposed to a blinding sun, though the photos before and after were perfect. When he told a local ranger, the man only looked at the dark water and whispered, "People forget how deep this loch really goes." The Sentinel of Tower 7. We return now to the high plains of Montana, to the winter of 1962. Imagine a steel radio tower standing like a skeletal finger on a snowy ridge, relaying microwave signals between silent military installations. It was known as Tower 7, and it was a place where the wind was the only constant companion, until the night the signal changed. Sink into the warmth of your room as the blizzard rages outside. Let the steady pulse of the radio be your guide. Elias Thorne, an electronics specialist who preferred the solitude of the midnight shift, was working alone that winter. His partner had been reassigned, leaving Leo to maintain the equipment in the small cinder block building at the tower's base. On a night where the air was frozen and perfectly still, a low tone began to seep through the receivers. It was a precise, steady frequency that didn't match any known channel. As Leo tried to isolate the sound, the entire console dimmed and the lights of the tower began to flicker. He stepped outside into the biting wind. Hovering barely 30 feet above the tip of the tower was a matte black disc, featureless and utterly silent. It sat in the sky like a hole cut out of the stars. Then, a thin beam of crimson light extended from the object, connecting directly to the top of the tower. The low tone returned, louder now, vibrating in Leo's chest and the very soil beneath his boots. For 2 minutes, the tower and the disk were linked by a thread of red light. Then the light snapped off, and the disk tilted and vanished into the night in a smooth, horizontal blur. Every recording tape from that night was found blank. Leo never reported the craft, only the equipment failure, but he noticed that the levitation of Tsarina. Our journey takes us now to a small village outside Samarkand, Uzbekistan, in the spring of 1995. It is a land of quiet farms and wide, golden skies, where the traditions of the past meet the mysteries of the heavens. Here, a young girl was about to experience a moment of weightlessness that would haunt the memory of her village for generations. Settle into the soft evening light. Imagine the scent of blooming orchards as we follow a path into the meadow. Tsarina was 10 years old, a shy girl who spent her afternoons drawing birds and clouds in her notebook. On a warm afternoon in late April, she wandered toward the edge of the fields. When she didn't return by sunset, her brother went to find her. He found her, but he didn't find her on the ground. Tsarina was floating. She hovered 10 feet in the air, her arms at her sides, perfectly upright and motionless. Above her, a perfect silver sphere hung in the sky, silent and matte, as if it were tethered to her by an invisible thread. When the villagers arrived, they found the air around the field unnaturally quiet, as if all sound had been drawn away by a vacuum. Tsarina's eyes were open, but she wasn't looking at the sphere or the people below. She was looking at something no one else could see. Then the sphere pulsed once and began to rise. Tsarina followed, ascending slowly until she reached 20 feet. Her body seemed to shimmer in the dying light, and then, as gently as a feather, she was lowered back to the earth. The sphere vanished instantly. Tsarina blinked, asked why everyone was crying, and realized she remembered nothing. She lived a long, peaceful life, but she always said her most vivid dreams were of perfect glowing spheres, and she only felt truly at peace when she was walking alone under the phantom mirror of Route 13. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. As the moonlight shifts across your floor, we find ourselves on a desolate stretch of Route 13 in rural Virginia. It is the autumn of 1980. Imagine the hum of a truck's engine and the rhythm of tires on asphalt, the only signs of life in a landscape swallowed by the dark. Here, two highway workers were about to see a version of reality that didn't belong to the road they knew. Settle into the stillness. Let the darkness beyond your window become a gateway. Marcus and Gideon were working the midnight shift, their headlights cutting narrow tunnels into the Virginia night. As they rounded a gentle curve, they saw something that made Marcus hit the brakes. Standing on the shoulder of the road was what looked like a tall, narrow pane of glass. It was a mirror nearly 6 feet tall, standing perfectly vertical without a frame or a stand. But as they approached, they realized it wasn't reflecting their headlights or the world behind them. Marcus stepped in front of the glass, but he saw no reflection of himself. Instead, the mirror showed the road continuing into a dense grove of pines, a road that curved sharply to the right where, in reality, there was only a straight path and empty fields. Within the mirror's world, a thick fog rolled across the false highway. Shapes moved in the distance, tall, thin shadows walking slowly through the trees. They had no faces, but they paused as if they could sense the watchers on the other side of the glass. When Gideon reached out to touch the surface, it had no temperature, neither cold nor warm. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic tone rang out, and for a terrifying second, Marcus saw Gideon's reflection inside the mirror, walking away into that impossible forest. Marcus grabbed his partner's arm and pulled him back just as the mirror vanished, not shattering, but simply seized the ridge of the faceless. The night carries us now to the remote, rugged highlands of Tasmania. It is 2010. Imagine a wilderness of steep ridges and ancient eucalyptus forests, a place where the trails vanish into the undergrowth and the silence is as old as the earth itself. Here, two researchers were conducting a survey when they realized they weren't the only ones observing the landscape. Sink deeper into the quiet. Let the rustle of the leaves in your mind lead you to the ridge. Sarah and Julian had spent 3 days cataloging bird calls in the deep wilderness. On their final evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the forest went unnaturally silent. No insects, no birds, not even a breeze. High above them on the ridge line, three figures appeared. They were far taller than any human, standing perfectly still with their arms at their sides. Through their binoculars, Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. "They don't have faces," she whispered. The heads were smooth, featureless domes of pale skin, lacking eyes, mouths, or ears. They watched the campsite for hours, never shifting their posture. By midnight, a low hum began to vibrate inside Julian's head, a pressure that felt as if his thoughts were being compressed. The figures didn't walk toward them. They began to slide down the ridge line in a straight, effortless motion without moving their limbs. Julian fired a flare into the sky. The sudden, blinding light caused the figures to freeze, and as the flare faded, they vanished like mist burned away by the sun. In the morning, the trees around their camp were scorched, the hushed fields of Ukraine. We travel now to the vast, golden wheat fields outside Vinnytsia, Ukraine. It is the autumn of 1987. Imagine the scent of sunflowers and barley, and a horizon that glows with the soft light of a setting sun. 3 generations of the Sokolov family had worked this soil, but one afternoon, the farm was wrapped in a silence so thick it felt like the world had been submerged in water. Settle into the peace of the harvest. Let the golden light guide you into the stillness. Viktor Sokolov was in the barn when the blue glow arrived. It didn't come from a lamp. It was a pulsing radiance like moonlight trapped in a deep well, pouring across the rafters and freezing the horses in their tracks. Victor walked outside to find his son, Andrei, standing on the porch, staring at the sky. Floating 15 feet above their wheat was an oval object, its center dark as obsidian, surrounded by slow-turning rings of light that shimmered like polished glass. It made no sound. As they watched, time began to stretch and warp. Victor's movements became slow, as if he were wading through thick syrup. A drop of sweat hung suspended on Andrei's cheek. The wind stopped. Clocks in the house ceased their ticking. Then a low resonance groaned from deep beneath the soil, a sound of something vast waking up. The wheat bent away from the object as if pushed by invisible hands. Then it ended. The object vanished and the clocks ticked forward again. But exactly 3 minutes of their lives were gone forever. Victor never spoke another word for the rest of his life. He wasn't frightened. He seemed to have heard something so final, so vast, that human language no longer had a purpose. To this day, the sunflowers on the Sokolov farm grow taller than any others. The silence of Akatuk. Our journey leads us now to the frozen western coast of Alaska. It is the winter of 1953. Imagine the roar of a bush plane's engine over the vast, white wilderness, a pilot flying a routine supply drop to a remote fishing village called Akatuk. But as the skis of the plane touched the ice, the pilot realized the village had lost its voice. Settle into the biting cold. Let the sound of the Arctic wind be your only companion as we walk into the empty town. Leo Vance had been flying to Akatuk for 5 years. He knew the smoke of their chimneys and the barking of their dogs, but this time there was only a total, crushing silence. Leo walked up the main path, but no one greeted him. Doors stood wide open to the freezing wind. Stew sat cold in the pots. Clothing was frozen stiff on the lines. There were no people, no dogs, and most hauntingly, no footprints in the fresh snow. It was as if the entire community had been lifted into the air in a single heartbeat. Inside the small schoolhouse, Leo found a sight that made his breath catch. All the chairs had been moved to the center of the room and arranged in a perfect, tight spiral. On the chalkboard, a circle filled with complex lines and dots had been drawn, the chalk snapping mid-stroke as if the artist had been interrupted. Leo fled back to his plane, feeling as if the very air was watching him. No bodies were ever found, and no tracks at the chamber beneath the frost. The night carries us now to the desolate Arctic island of Nova Zemlya. It is 1971. Imagine the Soviet Navy drilling deep beneath the permafrost, a world of reinforced steel, bitter cold, and total winter darkness. Here, past the limits of human engineering, a team of miners broke through a wall of ice and into a space that wasn't supposed to exist. Sink into the deep, dark layers of the earth. listened to the rhythmic pulse knocking from beneath the ice. The drill team reached 90 meters when they hit a cavity that was unnaturally smooth and dry. It wasn't a natural cave, it was a perfect sphere of silence. As the geophysicists descended with their lights, their equipment began to fail in irregular pulses. At the center of this impossible room was a rectangular stone platform, smooth, ancient, and warm to the touch. When Captain Viktor Petrov placed his hand upon the stone, he collapsed instantly. He fell into a coma that lasted 11 days, and when he finally woke, he didn't recognize his own name. Petrov spent his remaining days writing obsessively in a language made of curved, repeating symbols. He refused to eat, whispering only one word over and over, waiting. The chamber was sealed with concrete, the project was abandoned, and everyone involved was reassigned to the farthest corners of the Soviet Union. Today, satellite scans still show a mild heat signature emanating from the shimmering clearing of Idaho. Welcome back to Midnight Tales. As the shadows in your room grow long and the world outside falls into a heavy slumber, we travel to the rugged, evergreen heart of McCall, Idaho. It is the summer of 1998. Imagine an overgrown service road winding through the Piet National Forest, where the scent of pine is thick and the air feels ancient. Here, a man who spent his life working with the wires of the world was about to encounter a frequency that no machine could ever capture. Settle into the safety of your blankets. Let the buzz of the night become the static of the unknown. Arthur Finch, a retired lineman who understood the language of electricity, was walking his usual loop through the forest. He was a man of routine, grounded in the physical world, but that evening, the forest felt off. As he approached a clearing where a radio tower had once stood, a low whine of static began to ring in his ears. He checked his handheld radio out of habit. There was no signal, only a hollow, white noise that seemed to pulse across every band. The clearing ahead was glowing faintly, a shimmering haze that looked like heat rising off asphalt on a blistering day. The air felt charged, and the hairs on Arthur's arms stood at attention. In the center of the tall grass, a shape began to manifest. It wasn't flesh and bone. It was a tall, slim figure made of haze or smoke, flickering like a broken television signal. It swayed without wind, existing somewhere between the moments of time. Then, the static in Arthur's ears stopped instantly. The silence was so sudden it felt like a physical blow. The figure and others that had appeared beside it turned in perfect unison to face him. Arthur could not move. His legs felt heavy, as if he were wading through deep water. His watch froze. His radio hissed one final time and then died forever. The figures shimmered and vanished, leaving behind a circle of scorched earth where no plants would ever grow again. Arthur never spoke of that day, but he kept that broken radio on his shelf. Sometimes when a storm rolls in, the sapphire echo of the Blue Room. Our final journey tonight takes us back to the high desert of Espanola, New Mexico. It is 2005. Imagine a modest adobe house sitting alone on a quiet patch of desert, where the silence is only broken by the occasional dry whistle of the wind. But this house held a secret within its walls, a room painted a deep, unnatural blue that seemed to hum with a life of its own. Settle into the final moments of our story. Let the blue light guide you into the deepest stage of sleep. Julian Sterling moved into the rental property seeking privacy and peace. The house was perfect, save for a windowless side room painted in that startling shade of sapphire. Soon after he arrived, the dreams began, not nightmares, but vivid, weightless sequences of a voice whispering numbers and a slow-turning object suspended in an infinite dark. Julian would wake at exactly 3:33 a.m. Every night, the room 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house. He left a recorder in the blue room, and while it captured only silence for hours at 3:33 a.m., a soft mechanical click would echo through the tape as if a switch were being thrown far beneath the earth. One night, unable to sleep, Julian sat in the room and waited for the hour of the echo. At 3:33 a.m., the room didn't stay dark. It filled with an unnatural glow that leaked out from behind the walls. For a split second, the far side of the room seemed to stretch, becoming a tunnel that reached out toward the stars. Julian moved out a week later, leaving his deposit behind. He left a final note in the mailbox for whoever would come next, a warning that some rooms aren't meant for storage, but for listening. It read only,